Hello, it's Big Cheds. I'm back with another chapter of my battles with cancer, candid patient and caregiver's memoir. This is my story fighting cancer and taking care of my mom when she had cancer. And it's published on Amazon, audiobook, paperback, Kindle, along with my other books, Trading Quotes and Trading Wisdom. But I want this book to be for free for everybody. That's why I'm reading it here on YouTube at Cheds Trading, one chapter at a time. So, what's going on with mom? That's the last time we had another paradigm shift. We found out about my genetic disorder. Now, what's going on with mom? We're at the end of part 2. We're heading into the most difficult part for me in the book, but I'm going to fight through it, okay? So, what's going on with mom? Mom had a big trip coming up that she had been looking forward to for quite a while, comprised of 12 days split up between France and Dubai. And we discussed this trip with mom's doctor ahead of time, and the verdict was that she should be able to fly and fully participate, but if she ran into any trouble, she needed to call the hospital right away. I knew that mom really wanted to go on this trip, but I was worried about her health, and I really actually hoped that she would change her mind and stay at home and rest instead. That being said, I did understand that she really wanted to go. And at the end of the day, it was her choice. So I just had to hope for the best. Now, just 3 days before mom was scheduled to fly out, we met up for dinner to celebrate my daughter's birthday. When she showed up, I could not believe my eyes, as mom seemed to be in incredibly poor health. She was pale and fragile and moving with obvious discomfort. Mom was clearly fighting to put on a brave face as she smiled. I do not think she realized how badly she looked to others, as mom was focused solely on being there for her family on this important day. Mom has always been so close to her granddaughter and loved celebrating birthdays and other major holidays with family. She was not going to miss this one. Pulling mom aside, I came right out and I told her that, frankly, I was shocked at how poor she looked. And she assured me that she was on top of the issue and even had clearance from her doctor to travel. So I bit my tongue when she defiantly insisted on going overseas. I understood why, as this was a great opportunity to travel and to see some of those wonderful places she had often mentioned. To be frank, though, I thought to myself that she might not have another chance like this given her medical situation, but even still, I was worried, extremely worried. However, by the time we finished dinner, I was a little bit more convinced that mom would be able to pull it out due to how strong a person she was. And before saying goodbye for the night, we went over the logistics of getting her to the airport. We decided that she would first drop her car off at my house, and then I would take her to the airport shuttle. The following day, mom was in even more pain than she had been at the birthday party, and she went to the hospital to get checked out. The nurse on call concluded that she was constipated and sent her home with some medicine. Mom, not deterred by the experience, decided to push forward with her travel plans despite my protests, and she showed up at my house the next morning with gusto. She arrived with 2 suitcases, one large and one small, and proceeded to empty the full contents of both onto my living room floor in a hectic attempt to reorganize her belongings. I was a little bit surprised at this, expecting her to already be packed and ready to go, and mom explained that her day had been hectic and that was why she was running behind. As I looked up at the clock, I realized we had only a few minutes before we had to leave, and I encouraged her to pick up the pace to get ready. Watching all this go down, I wondered if mom was stalling, perhaps, with some part of her maybe not wanting to go on the trip. It was now or never, so we loaded mom's stuff into the car and we set off for the bus station, rushing to get there in time for that 4 o'clock bus. And thankfully, the traffic was light. And after arriving, mom went to buy her ticket while I brought her luggage inside. I wished her a wonderful trip and I hugged her goodbye. And then I asked her where her phone was so she could call my sister and let her know that she was on her way. Mom searched all around and could not find it, so I called the number and let it ring, and well, she opened up her luggage to see if the phone was there. After going through her things, we still could not find it, so I ran out to the car, called the number again, and searched beneath the seats of the car before returning to Mom empty-handed. This whole mess left me incredulous. And I quickly debated if I should drive back to my house to grab her phone or send Mom off to the airport and thus abroad without it. This process of getting her ready for the vacation had been a disaster and was getting worse by the minute. Now, I was panicking. I was beginning to panic, and I called my sister to let her know that we couldn't find Mom's phone. And she insisted that it would be no problem, as Mom would be able to communicate using her phone. With what seemed like a reasonable suggestion, I shrugged my shoulders and wished Mom a safe and enjoyable vacation before returning home to catch my breath after such a hectic ordeal. Once I was back home, I searched all around the house, and I was cursing myself for not making sure that Mom had her phone before we left. After being unable to find the phone, I decided that I needed to chill out for a bit, so that's what I did. And then, after a couple of hours, I called Mom's phone again just to see if I could hear it ring. This time, the result was different, and it immediately went to voicemail, and that left me puzzled. Then I realized it meant that Mom's cell phone was out of service because it was in her luggage and crossing the ocean with her. After making this discovery, I sent a text message to my sister to let her know that I'd figured out where Mom's phone was, and then I washed my hands of the whole ordeal. From the dinner with Mom, when she was looking so weak, to going to the hospital the next day with pain and discomfort, to haphazardly packing and then losing and then ultimately not losing her phone, the preparation for this trip had been an utter disaster. And all that made me wonder if the universe was trying to tell us something. I didn't hear from my mom or my sister until about 2 days later when I received an email explaining that Mom's condition had taken a turn for the worse. She had been admitted to a hospital in France with pancreatitis. The doctors are running several tests, including an ultrasound and CT scan, and after consulting with their oncology team here in the United States, they recommended that Mom fly back as soon as possible and go straight to the emergency room. According to the Mayo Clinic, pancreatitis is an inflammation in the pancreas. Pancreatitis occurs when digestive enzymes become activated while still in the pancreas, irritating the cells of your pancreas and causing inflammation. The oncology staff had indeed encouraged Mom to go on this trip and to enjoy herself if she felt up to it, but also to report back if she encountered any problems. And this certainly qualified as such. While Mom was undergoing these tests at the hospital in France, my sister was trying to arrange a flight back for Mom to the United States. She was also trying to arrange for someone to fly back with her, as Mom was feeling so weak that she could not travel all alone. Here back at home, we prepared for her to stay with us after her eventual discharge from the hospital. We also tried to figure out if one of us could fly back and escort her, fly back out there and escort her back. Over the next 24 to 48 hours, we awaited further instructions from my sister, and then they came. My brother-in-law's mother had offered to fly back with Mom. They would be arriving the following morning, where I was supposed to meet Mom and take her straight to the ER. My sister let me know that she had already coordinated with Mom's medical oncology team here, and they would be expecting her later that morning. When I arrived at the airport the next day, I was anxious to see Mom and to know that she was back in the United States, safe and sound. Once she cleared customs, she slowly walked over with me to the waiting area, and I could not believe how frail she was. Several times we had to stop as she was having trouble maintaining her balance, and clearly she would not have been able to walk all on her own. Driving with her to the hospital, I looked over at her and lovingly smiled, thinking about how great it was to have her back with me, and I kept reminding her that she was home now and everything would be okay. From her demeanor, it was easy to tell that she had been through a lot of trauma. So I comforted her by explaining that it would take some time for her to recover emotionally from the experience. Once we arrived at the hospital, I valeted my car and then escorted her gently over to the emergency room before checking in at the front desk. After giving the staff Mom's name, they indicated that they were indeed expecting her, and they asked us to wait briefly before escorting Mom into a side room where her vital signs were taken. As all this was happening, I was taken back in my mind to a time and place when I was the cancer patient and had to be admitted to this exact same ER with a fever. Everything seemed the same to me now, except this time I was the strong one and my mother was the weak one. Still, I felt vulnerable nonetheless. Even the nurse seemed familiar, so much so that I wondered if she had been the exact same one who took my vital signs when I was in need of urgent care. Now that Mom had been properly processed, a room was made available, and the nurse escorted us back to the heart of the emergency room where all the action was. We reached a fork in the road and then took a left down a hallway, and that hallway was filled with patients on stretchers along both sides of the wall. As we passed by these people, I tried not to look too closely so as not to intrude on their privacy, but I was still curious as to why they were there. Some had large bandages or were clutching their extremities in pain and were easy to figure out. However, it was the folks who looked otherwise normal to me that I imagined would be the most interesting to talk to. Every square inch in that hallway was spoken for, as nurses and doctors alike rushed past us in a desperate attempt to triage the chaos. Mom was brought into a medium-sized room with a patient's bed and nurse station, and we drew the curtain closed to give her some privacy as she settled in. A little bit later, a doctor stopped by to try to get a grasp on what was going on with Mom, and she asked why she had landed in the emergency room that day. This woman had an athletic build with war-weary eyes and messy blonde hair, and in some ways she reminded me of a masked superhero. Mom started out by telling her some of the details from her trip to France, including what symptoms had led her to be admitted to the hospital there. To help the doctors get up to speed, Mom brought with her a folder of medical information from the overseas hospital, which she handed over to this mysterious masked doctor. The doctor pored over the documents with a confused look in her eyes, and I assume her face as well, but I could not see beneath the mask, and that made me even more curious as to what she looked like. Noticing that she was confused, I jumped in and gave this doctor some more of my version of Mom's backstory, starting with just how poorly she looked when we met for dinner days before her trip. Mom jumped back in, wanting the facts to be known in her voice. And after a while, I observed that the way in which Mom and I were interrupting one another made it difficult for this doctor to get the story straight. When all was said and done, the doctor, in consultation with Mom's oncologist, decided to run a brand new set of tests to establish a baseline, regardless of what had been done at the hospital in France. They ordered a CT scan, an ultrasound, an EKG, and blood tests, while they put Mom on an IV, and they gave her some medicine for the pain. Once things had settled down and we began to talk, Mom mentioned just how happy she was to be back here in the States. She also appreciated how thorough this hospital was compared to the overseas one, and she made the point to me that the staff at this hospital double-checked everything, whereas the hospital in France did nothing like that. After another hour of waiting, a room had been made ready for Mom in the main hospital, and the staff showed up to escort her there. So I kissed her goodbye, and I left to go pick up my daughter from school. The following day, Mom called me to report that she had a really nice sleep and she was feeling better, and that the doctors had her on a liquid diet while they tried to solve her digestive issues. She also mentioned that she had just been visited by her medical oncologist, and the doctor told Mom that sometimes there's an initial reaction to the Keytruda, and then the patient will adapt. And this suggested to the doctors that Mom might be able to continue with that Keytruda treatment once her acute issues had settled down, once her immediate issues had settled down. To my ears, this was good news, as Keytruda seemed like our best option at this point, with the chemotherapy no longer working. And I still firmly holding on to the hope that this was all going to work out for Mom. By the following day, Mom had moved on from her liquid diet to solid food, and she was proud to report that she had enjoyed some eggs and potatoes for breakfast. And it was nice to hear that her diet was back on track, as in my mind, that would help her get out of the hospital sooner rather than later. She confided in me that she was a little bit depressed, and in many ways she felt overwhelmed, and she lamented the loss of control over her day-to-day activities. In response, I expressed that I did understand how she was feeling, and I imagined that she was, quote unquote, peeling away the shock of the last week or so. In a 7-day span, Mom had flown overseas while sick, been to the hospital in a foreign country, and then traveled back in pain. And now she was in the emergency room undergoing tests left and right. From my view, she was just trying to take a breath and to gain some perspective. And that would come in time as Mom slowly peeled away the shock. When we spoke again the following day, she explained that the doctors were still trying to figure out the exact root of her painful gastrointestinal problems. The initial test had indeed confirmed that she had pancreatitis, but they were unsure if it was because of the immunotherapy treatment or the underlying condition of colorectal cancer. So as a result, the doctor told Mom that they might have to consider putting a stent inside her body to help her function better. According to Wise Geek, a pancreatic stent is a small tube that is inserted into the pancreatic duct to allow materials to drain. Mom was finally ready to go home from the hospital 5 days later, and we were both incredibly excited to get her out of there after such a long ordeal. Once the wheelchair arrived for Mom, I escorted her downstairs and over to the valet area, and then helped her get in the car so we could begin our drive home. As we made our way down the street, Mom mentioned that she just could not wait to get home and to collapse onto the bed that we had set up for her, the same bed that we had used to have her recover from her previous trips to the hospital. And I let her know that everything was indeed ready and all set, and that we would take great care of her. And I told her that I was just elated to have her out of the hospital and back in my care again. About halfway home, she asked if we could pass by a Dunkin' Donuts location, and she told me she was craving an egg white flatbread sandwich. I thought it was perhaps a bit too soon for her to be eating something that complex, but I indulged her nonetheless. After retrieving this delight for Mom, I watched as she closed her eyes and eagerly nibbled at that sandwich. I was elated to have her out of the hospital and hopeful that she was finally on the path to recovery. At home, I escorted her into the room where she did in fact collapse onto that bed, and after which I turned off the lights and sat at my computer. Moments later, I heard her snoring, and I looked over at her with a strong sense of relief. It was so nice to know that she was back at home where I could keep an eye on her and to know that she could rest there comfortably. As she slept, I returned my focus to this cancer memoir, and I found it really strange to be editing previous chapters about mom resting at my house after leaving the hospital when she was doing the exact same thing again now. And I wondered to myself if we were really making any progress or if we were just going in circles. I greatly look forward to a time when we could put this whole episode behind us. A few hours later, mom woke up from her nap and she told me that her stomach was hurting. My first thought was to ask her how much of that sandwich she had eaten, and I looked at her astonishingly when she told me that she finished the entire sandwich. When I asked her why she did that, given that she had just recently started eating solid food, she told me that she had been craving something warm and emotionally satisfying after such a long and stressful stay in the hospital. I felt responsible. I felt at least partially responsible for letting that happen, but I completely understood why she ate that whole sandwich in a quest to satisfy a craving and in a quest to feel more like a normal person. After we talked a little bit more, mom took some pain medication and laid back down again with one hand on her forehead and one hand on her abdomen. By the following day, she was doing a lot better, and we were both pleased that she was ready to eat more solid food. I was also encouraged to see her using her laptop again and reaching out to her friends via email. It is so important to maintain those connections when you're feeling down and isolated. When my daughter came home from school later that day, it was an absolute joy to watch her sit on the bed and playing card games with her grandmother. Mom was doing much better, and it was just fantastic to have her spending this time with my daughter, knowing that each moment is so precious. My mom has always been such an important figure in my daughter's life and has been a great influence on her, and I looked forward to them spending even more time together as mom rested at home with us. The following day, however, mom had unfortunately taken a step back and she was feeling weaker. And even though she was eating solid food and able to have regular bowel movements, she was in a lot of pain. That morning, she consulted with my sister and she suggested that we call the hospital to update them on mom's status just to be safe. The doctor asked mom about how much she had been eating and drinking and came to the conclusion that mom was severely dehydrated and told her to come back into the hospital as soon as possible. I absolutely felt responsible for not keeping a closer eye on how much water mom was drinking. Instead, I had been focused on her comfort level and the fact that she was eating solid food again. So we packed up some of her belongings and we left for the hospital just a few minutes later. It just so turned out that I had an appointment at the hospital myself that day to meet with the genetic counselor and doctor. In addition to feeling extremely weak, mom was in noticeable discomfort as we made our way into the city. I tried to console her by telling her that the hospital would take great care of her and that I promised her that we would sort things out as soon as possible. I still thought that perhaps the doctors were being overly cautious by bringing mom into the hospital, but I understood that it was better to be safe than sorry. Once mom was readmitted, the doctors ordered a new round of tests, including blood tests and a CT scan, so they could compare that to her prior baseline results. When the blood test came back, it was clear that the pancreatitis had returned, and that was the reason for the discomfort mom was experiencing. They also diagnosed her with severe dehydration, and they hooked her up to an IV machine to give her fluids. That gave me some comfort because I knew that they could at least fix the dehydration. And upon hearing her condition from the doctors, I felt guilty about my earlier hesitation to bring her to the hospital over something as simple as dehydration. Yet another reminder that I was in over my head. About an hour or so later, it was time for that CT scan, so I brought mom downstairs to the imaging area. After helping her fill out some paperwork, I set off for my appointments with the genetic counselor and doctor. Counselor greeted me with a smile and then asked me how I was feeling about my positive test result, presumably expecting me to be sad or upset. And on the contrary, I explained to her that I have always had that genetic disorder. I just found out about it now. And I said that that was a good thing because knowledge is power. Staying with the idea of positive thinking, I told her I was ready to move forward and ready to accept the cards that I had been dealt. That was all that mattered to me. I also told her that with the knowledge of this disorder, I would be able to make the lifestyle changes necessary to remain healthy. The counselor seemed pleasantly surprised by what I had to say, and she told me that I was taking the right approach. After speaking a little bit more, we wrapped up the appointment, and I thanked her for her time before I went to meet up with the genetic doctor. The doctor walked in and greeted me with a smile, and she was full of positive energy. And just as the counselor had before, the doctor asked me how I was feeling about the positive test result, and I told her that I was doing well and was not bothered by the news. Furthermore, I explained that I had come to terms with my new reality, and I was thankful that I knew about my condition, and that way I'd be able to stay on top of it as I get older. The doctor again confirmed that I would be having a colonoscopy, an upper endoscopy, and a dermatological test right away to form a baseline. She said that if anything troubling was found on the upper endoscopy, we would repeat that procedure in a year, but otherwise it would be every 2 years. And the colonoscopy and endoscopy could be performed on the same day, which was nice. In addition, she said that I would have to fast for 24 hours before the procedure, and then I'd have to drink something called Miralax. I'd never heard of that before, so I looked it up, and according to drugs.com, Miralax is a laxative solution that increases the amount of water in the intestinal tract to stimulate bowel movements. I was not happy about having to fast for an entire day, but she told me that I could still have some stuff like chicken broth and Jell-O, and that made the prospect seem a little bit more tolerable. After all this, I thanked the doctor, and then I set off to head home and to try to decompress from all the events that day. On my way home, I called Mom to check in and to see how she was doing and to find out what the result of that CT scan was. She told me the scan revealed nothing new, and the doctors again concluded that she was dehydrated and was suffering from pancreatitis. She was resting comfortably there at the hospital, and we both agreed that she would likely be there for a few more days, and then she could come back to my place, and I looked forward to that time. The following day, I stopped by the main hospital with my wife to visit Mom, and we brought with us a few key items that she had requested to keep her busy while she was there. My dad happened to be visiting at the same time, so I got to see him, and that was a pleasant surprise. Mom let us know that the doctors had her back on a liquid diet as they tried to rehydrate her and tried to deal with the pancreatitis. The general consensus was that she had been discharged too soon last time, and they were going to try to take things a lot more slowly this time as they attempted to stabilize her. They were still not sure what had triggered the pancreatitis, be it the immunotherapy or enlarged lymph nodes from the cancer, creating a mechanical obstruction near her pancreatic duct. The doctors were in constant contact with Mom's medical oncologist as well, because the goal was to get her back in that immunotherapy as soon as possible. But that could not happen until she was out of the hospital and had fully recovered from the pancreatitis. Dealing with the pancreatitis was the immediate priority, so she had to stop eating and became really weak due to a lack of nutrition. So in order to stabilize her further, the doctors wanted Mom to have surgery to put in that stent. The following day, I arrived with a big bag of stuff for Mom, including several days of mail from home, an address book, and some fuzzy purple slippers. I noticed right away how weak Mom was, but it was still nice to see her nonetheless and to be able to spend some time with her. Mom told me that the doctors had been unable to implant that stent due to the fact that there were polyps or enlarged lymph nodes in the area of her pancreas. Instead, they had to wait for the inflammation to go down further before they could try again. According to Wikipedia, a polyp is an abnormal growth of tissue projecting from a mucous membrane. If it's attached to the surface by a narrow, elongated stalk, it's said to be pedunculated. If no stalk is present, it's said to be sessile. Polyps are commonly found in the colon, stomach, nose, ear, sinuses, urinary bladder, and uterus. Citation. Since they were unable to proceed with the stent, I was worried about what would happen next and how they were going to make Mom feel more comfortable. The experience of seeing her weak and in pain was traumatic, so I decided to go for a walk around the hospital to try to clear my mind. Once I returned to Mom's room, I found her watching television, and I said, "Do you want to go take a walk with me? Let's go take a view of the city." And she said yes. And so ever slowly, she gathered her strength and got up out of bed. Tethered to her IV machine, she made her way past the nurse's desk with one hand on my arm for support, and we inched down the hallway and towards the waiting area that was nestled in between two elevators. About 10 feet long and wide, it was arranged with chairs strategically placed to provide an optimal view out over the city. Mom remarked about how nice it was to be out of her room and to see a little bit of life outside of the hospital, telling me once again just how much she looked forward to coming back to my house. I understood how she felt, and I told Mom that I felt the same way during my 5-day hospital visit before Christmas, when I was just desperate to get out. Once we returned to the room and chatted for a little while, Mom's oncologist stopped by to see how she was holding up. I had been hoping to run into Mom's doctor, as I had a series of questions already lined up that were designed to help me understand some of the many moving parts of her medical situation. The doctor told me that they were still trying to figure out what was going on with Mom's lungs, and they would be performing further tests to find out. For now, they were not worried about that. The immediate concern was her pancreatitis and the accompanying discomfort, and they were giving her some medication for that. Despite the frustration of that setback, there was still some potentially good news. The doctors confirmed that the pancreatitis that Mom was experiencing was not a side effect of the immunotherapy, but rather was a reaction to the inflammation of the lymph nodes near her pancreas. I took great note of that information because that suggested that Mom would be able to continue with immunotherapy once things calmed down. Despite the urgency of Mom's acute issues, the oncology team was still keeping an eye on the bigger picture, and they let Mom know that once she was discharged, they would give her about a week to recover and then would bring her back to resume the immunotherapy treatment. One of those acute issues was that she had become severely malnourished, and to help reverse that trend, the doctors had started her on something called TPN. According to Wikipedia, TPN, or parenteral nutrition, is the feeding of specialist nutritional products to a person intravenously, bypassing the usual process of eating and digestion. The person receives highly complex nutritional formula that contained nutrients such as glucose, salts, amino acids, lipids, and added vitamins and dietary minerals. It's called total parenteral nutrition, or total nutrient admixture, when no significant nutrition is obtained by other routes, and partial parenteral nutrition, PPN, when nutrition is also partially enteric. So more or less, as I understood it, this is the best way to keep a patient alive when they're unable to get the basic nutrition they need by eating. The doctor explained that she would be getting the TPN overnight through an IV drip for as long as she needed to return to normal strength. After the doctor left, I told Mom not to worry, as I had taken copious notes from the visit. Mom tended to get overwhelmed with everything that was going on, and she would often forget important details. I also told her that we would get through this arduous process one step at a time, and I told her that I would be there for her all the way. Despite all the chaos of Mom's medical Pardon me. Despite all the chaos of Mom's medical situation, I was really taking pride in the fact that I had been recording these events. That way, I would be able to share my recollections with Mom down the road, and that would help her with the process of emotional recovery after her physical recovery was complete. As for now, the plan was for Mom to come back to my place in a few days' time. So I wished her well, and I set off to return home to prepare things for her arrival. And it was really hard to leave her alone in the hospital, knowing that she was doing so poorly, but she was in good hands, and I had to return to my work, my wife, and my daughter, among other obligations. The following day, Mom gave me a phone call and told me that there had been yet another setback, and she would not be ready to come home for at least a few more days. The doctors were still trying to stabilize her from the inflammation and the abdominal pain, and Mom told me that she was beyond frustrated, but realized there was nothing she could do about it. And so we talked for a while before I told her that I loved her. I told her to hang in there and that I would speak to her soon. The next chapter, I don't think you understand how serious it is. This is a really big chapter we're about to start. It's one of the hardest chapters for me. This is my battles with cancer, a patient and caregiver's candid memoir. This is my story of fighting cancer, surviving cancer, and then taking care of my mother while she fought cancer. And it's available on Amazon, Kindle, paperback, and audiobook, along with Trading Quotes, my other two books, Trading Quotes and Trading Wisdom. But I want this book to be free. I want it to be available to anybody, who it might help. And this has been my mission. This has always been my goal, was to do it this way. So one chapter at a time here on Cheds Trading. Thank you for listening, and I will be back with another chapter soon. Take care, folks.